Welcome back to International Relations 101. I'm William Spaniel. Today's topics are United Nations Security Council voting and veto power. Let's get to it. To begin, let's talk about the explicit voting rules within the Security Council. The Security Council follows a supermajoritarian rule with a twist. To pass, a resolution needs at least 9 votes in favor, remembering that there are 15 total members of the Security Council at any given time. And in addition to that, the resolution must have 0 votes from permanent members against it. In other words, every single permanent member of the UN Security Council has veto power over a resolution. If any of them vote no, that resolution is dead in the water. For example, here is the current membership within the Security Council. 5 permanent members, 10 rotating non-permanent members. If you had a vote like this, the resolution would pass. All 5 permanent members are voting yes, and we have 4 non-permanent members joining them. That's 9 total affirmative votes, and so it doesn't matter that the other 6 non-permanent members have voted no here, the resolution passes. In contrast, a vote that looks like this would fail. Here we have 4 permanent members voting affirmative, and all 10 non-permanent members also voting affirmative. The lone holdout we have is from the United States. But because the United States is a permanent member, and all permanent members have veto power, it doesn't matter that this is a 14-1 vote. This vote fails. The resolution will not pass. To be clear, there is a way for a resolution to pass even if a permanent member does not vote affirmatively on it. Members can abstain from voting. That's not a yes, and it's not a no. So if we had 14 total yes votes, 4 from permanent members and 10 coming from non-permanent members, and the United States was abstaining rather than vetoing, this resolution would pass. In other words, to veto a resolution, you have to actively vote no on it. When people first learn about this veto system, their immediate reaction tends to be thinking that this is unfair, and thus they wonder how we got to this situation in the first place. The answer in part is because of World War II. All 5 permanent members are the major power winners of that war. They were the ones in charge of the world system in the post-World War era, and as a consequence, they set up a system that favored them and not so much others. The other half of the story is a little more complicated. All international organizations face a trade-off between legitimacy and irrelevance. As the main governing body of the world, legitimacy is very important for the United Nations. As a consequence, the rules within the UN cannot be so ridiculously distorted to more powerful actors. Otherwise, it would suffer from a legitimacy failure. On the other hand, this is international relations. There is no third-party enforcement of rules and regulations and laws. And as a consequence, there's a limit to how much you can do within an organization and still have everyone want to participate. This is the problem that the League of Nations faced following World War I. Participation in the League of Nations required following a stringent set of rules. The United States did not want to participate as a result, and in turn, the League of Nations suffered from an irrelevancy crisis. As a result, the League of Nations barely survived more than a quarter of a century. And in contrast, and precisely because of the disproportionate power that the permanent members have on the UN Security Council, the United Nations has sustained itself ever since World War II and doesn't show any real signs of slowing down. Of course, that doesn't mean that the Security Council isn't without problems. If you think about the bottom end of the permanent membership and how much military and geopolitical clout those countries have, and compare them to the most powerful and most geopolitically important countries that do not have permanent membership, countries like Germany, Japan, India, and Brazil, well, they're pretty close. Correspondingly, there's been a recent push to have some level of permanent membership for countries like these four. The problem with actually getting to that point, however, is that the status quo currently benefits the permanent 5 members, and as a consequence, they're going to be reluctant to consent to reforming the institution. Instead, the half-measure solution that we have is that these countries tend to be participants on the Security Council as non-permanent members on a more frequent basis than other countries that do not have as much geopolitical or military power. To be clear, there are limits on what permanent membership on the Security Council must look like before there is a legitimacy crisis. And for proof, all you need to do is jump back in a time machine. If you go to the end of World War II and the foundation of the United Nations, the Security Council's permanent members were originally the United States, the Soviet Union, the Republic of China, France, and the United Kingdom. Think about the subtlety there. When World War II began, China was already in the midst of a civil war. It was nationalists, led by Chiang Kai-shek on the left here, versus communists, led by Mao Zedong. When Imperial Japan invaded, the sides took a time out to work together to beat them back. Of course, they were eventually successful. And when the Allies won World War II, the Republic of China received the seat on the United Nations Security Council. But the Civil War restarted, and eventually the nationalists were driven out of mainland China. The Republic of China instead retreated to Taiwan, where they stay today. This set the stage for a legitimacy crisis. In fact, the Soviet Union began boycotting the United Nations as a consequence of the Republic of China representing Chinese political interests within the United Nations. On one hand, this wasn't surprising. The Republic of China was allied with the United States, and the Soviet Union had an affiliation with Communist China. But they did have a point here, too. Part of the reason why permanent members have that privileged position is because of their geopolitical and military power. The Republic of China, being defeated within the Chinese Civil War, didn't seem to live up to that standard. And so, by that logic, it was reasonable to expect that mainland China would be representing China within the United Nations. Nevertheless, the boycott was actually a terrible idea. Think about the makeup of the permanent membership of the Security Council at that point. It was the United States, the Republic of China, the United Kingdom, and France. With the Soviet Union not there to actively vote no to veto resolutions, basically anything that the United States wanted to pass, it could pass. And as a consequence, this is why the United Nations authorized intervention into the Korean War on behalf of the South. The Soviet Union was not there to veto it. Realizing its mistake, the Soviet Union quickly returned. Nevertheless, the Soviet Union's main point still stood, and eventually they won the debate. United Nations General Assembly Resolution 2758 switched Chinese representation within the UN from the Republic of China to mainland China. This is interesting because the General Assembly does not have the force of law, unlike the Security Council resolutions. But the General Assembly does have bureaucratic power within the United Nations, and as a consequence, it can change who is representing a country within the UN, which has a spillover effect on what's going on with the rest of the United Nations. That being said, there was relatively broad support on the resolution. Countries in green voted in favor to shift representation to mainland China. Countries in red were voting no, and countries in blue abstained. The key thing to look at here is that in Western Europe, countries that otherwise tend to be allied with the United States, especially in ideological positions like this, actually voted in favor of the resolution. The final change to permanent membership happened at the end of the Cold War. When the Soviet Union fell apart, Russia became the designated successor state, and this is the permanent membership that we have today. The United States, Russia, mainland China, France, and the United Kingdom. In light of all of that, there are a couple of time trends worth noting. First is the number of resolutions passed. Here, I've binned them into two different time periods. On the left, we have the Cold War period, from 1945 to 1990. During that time, just under 700 resolutions got through the United Nations Security Council. On the right, we have the post-Cold War period, from 1991 to today. And during that time, we have more than 1,800 resolutions passed. It shouldn't be surprising that there is that discrepancy. After all, because of veto power on the Security Council, in order for something to pass during the Cold War, both the United States and the Soviet Union had to agree to it, except for that brief period of time when the Soviet Union was boycotting. That was a tall order, and as a consequence, we don't have very many resolutions passing per year. In the post-Cold War period, things are rosier between Russia and the United States. They're not perfectly aligned, so the Security Council isn't constantly passing resolutions without problem, but it is easier to do it. And in fact, if you look a little bit more closely at the data, the post-Cold War period is only a 30-year time span. In contrast, the Cold War period is 45 years. And so if you adjust for the fact that there are fewer years post-Cold War than during the Cold War, there are 4 times as many resolutions passed per year in the post-Cold War period than there were during the Cold War period. The last thing worth noting is the change in the distribution of vetoes over time. Here we have each of the countries with veto power and the time period in which they have actively cast one of those vetoes. You'll notice for the blue period, from 1946 to 1969, it's almost exclusively the Soviet Union that's exercising its veto right. That trend reverses in the latter half of the Cold War period in orange. There, the Soviet Union has relatively few vetoes. Instead, it's Western countries exercising that power: the United States, the United Kingdom, and France. The post-Cold War period in red has seen another change. Russia is back to vetoing actively, the United States hasn't stopped vetoing, and now China is getting in on the action as well. Meanwhile, France and the United Kingdom have stopped vetoing, although the inference there is a little bit difficult to make. It could very well be the case that France and the United Kingdom are free-riding on the United States' veto. In other words, if they want to play a more neutral role on the Security Council, but don't really like a resolution, and they know that the United States plans to veto, then they can just abstain and free-ride off the US taking that action instead. That wraps up the formal rules within the United Nations Security Council. But I want to go back to a point from earlier. This is still international relations, and we still have the enforcement problem. So what we're observing in the formal rules might not be the full story of what goes on within the Security Council. And that's what we're going to be exploring in the next couple of lectures. I hope you enjoyed this, and I hope to see you next time. Take care.